You're a peasant in 1945 Egypt, digging for fertilizer near some ancient cliffs, when your shovel hits something that shouldn't be there. You've just uncovered what scholars would later call the most important religious discovery of the 20th century, but right now, you're thinking about selling these weird old books to buy cigarettes. Muhammad Ali al-Samman had no idea he'd just unearthed texts that would completely flip our understanding of early Christianity on its head. But here's where it gets really wild. These weren't just any old books. These were the forbidden Gospels. The ones the early church tried so hard to destroy that they literally buried them in the desert for 600 years. And what they contained was so explosive that when scholars first read them, some actually questioned whether they should publish the translations at all. The Nag Hammadi Library contains texts that present Jesus saying things like, "I am not your master," and describe a completely different version of creation, where the God of the Old Testament isn't the true divine being but a deluded, cosmic mistake. Now pause for a second and think about that. Every Sunday service, every prayer, every fundamental belief about the nature of God and Jesus that billions of people hold today. What if it was all based on the winning side of an ancient theological war, and the losers' books were literally buried in jars in the Egyptian desert? The 13 leather-bound codices that Muhammad Ali found contained 52 separate texts, most of them completely unknown to modern scholarship. But here's what's absolutely mind-bending. These weren't copies of copies like most ancient texts. Some of these were translations from original Greek texts that were older than many books that made it into the Bible. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about texts that were contemporary with the canonical Gospels, written by people who claim to have direct access to Jesus' secret teachings. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, presents Jesus not as a sacrificial savior, but as a wisdom teacher who spoke in cryptic sayings designed to spark enlightenment. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. That's not exactly accept Jesus as your personal savior, is it? But wait, it gets stranger. The Gospel of Philip suggests that Mary Magdalene wasn't just a follower. She was Jesus' companion who received special knowledge that the other disciples envied. The text literally says the Savior loved her more than all the other disciples and used to kiss her often on the mouth. The other disciples are described as being offended by this relationship. Now imagine if that version had become Orthodox Christianity instead of what we got. We'd be living in a completely different world. The discovery happened at exactly the right moment in history too, which makes you wonder about timing and fate. This was just 2 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, launching what scholars call the golden age of biblical archaeology. But here's what most people don't know. The Nag Hammadi texts almost didn't survive the discovery. Muhammad Ali's mother used some of the papyrus pages as kindling for her oven. Can you imagine? Pages that contained potentially revolutionary spiritual insights, burned to cook dinner. Some of the most profound wisdom teachings in human history, literally going up in smoke because nobody realized what they were looking at. The texts that did survive reveal a completely different theological landscape than what most people imagine existed in early Christianity. These weren't fringe cult writings. They represent entire schools of thought that were once widespread and influential. The Gnostics, as we call them now, weren't some weird sect hiding in caves. They had sophisticated theological systems, elaborate creation myths, and detailed spiritual practices that rivaled anything in Orthodox Christianity. Take the Secret Book of John, which presents a creation story that would make most Christians today absolutely lose their minds. According to this text, the material world wasn't created by the true God at all, but by a false deity called the Demiurge, who thought he was the only God in existence. This false God creates the physical universe as a prison to trap divine sparks of consciousness, that's us, in matter. The true God is so transcendent and perfect that the material world is actually a cosmic mistake. Sound familiar? If you've ever felt like you don't belong in this world, like you're trapped in circumstances beyond your control, like there's something fundamentally wrong with physical existence itself, well, you might be having a Gnostic moment. But here's where the historical facts get really juicy. The early church fathers weren't just casually disagreeing with these ideas. They were absolutely terrified of them. Irenaeus, one of the most influential early church leaders, wrote an entire book called Against Heresies, specifically to refute Gnostic teachings. But here's what's fascinating. The only way we knew anything about most Gnostic beliefs before the Nag Hammadi discovery was through these hostile refutations. It's like learning about democracy by reading criticism written by dictators. When scholars finally got to read the actual Gnostic texts, instead of just attacks on them, they discovered that the Church Fathers had been systematically misrepresenting and strawmanning these teachings for centuries. The real Gnostic texts were far more sophisticated and nuanced than the caricatures suggested. But why were Orthodox Christians so threatened by these ideas? Think about it from their perspective. If salvation comes through secret knowledge rather than faith in Jesus' sacrifice, then you don't need priests or churches or elaborate institutions. If the divine spark is already within you waiting to be awakened, then religious authority becomes irrelevant. If the material world is a prison created by a false god, then earthly political power loses its divine mandate. These weren't just theological disagreements, they were competing visions of how human society should be organized. The orthodox position that eventually won out emphasized faith, obedience to church authority, and the inherent goodness of the created world under a benevolent God. The Gnostic position emphasized direct personal experience of the divine, skepticism toward religious authorities, and the idea that true reality exists beyond the physical world. Guess which one was more appealing to political leaders trying to maintain control over large populations? But here's what's really going to bend your brain. Some scholars argue that certain Nag Hammadi texts preserve earlier and more authentic versions of Jesus' teachings than what made it into the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, is just a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus with no narrative framework, no birth story, no crucifixion, no resurrection. Just pure teachings. Some of these sayings appear in modified forms in the canonical Gospels, but others are completely unique. What if this stripped-down version is actually closer to what the historical Jesus really taught? What if the elaborate theological framework of Orthodox Christianity, the Trinity, original sin, substitutionary atonement, were later developments that obscured rather than clarified the original message? The implications are staggering. We're not just talking about interesting historical footnotes here. We're talking about the possibility that Western civilization has been built on a theological foundation that won through political maneuvering rather than spiritual authenticity. The Nag Hammadi texts suggest that early Christianity was far more diverse, mystical, and philosophically sophisticated than most people realize. These weren't primitive superstitions, they were complex spiritual systems that engaged seriously with questions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human potential. And here's the kicker. Muhammad Ali, the peasant who found these texts, never learned to read. He had no idea that he'd uncovered documents that would challenge 2,000 years of religious orthodoxy. He just wanted to sell some old books to make a few extra pounds. Sometimes the most world-changing discoveries happen through the most ordinary people doing the most mundane things. The universe apparently has a sense of irony. Today, you can read translations of these texts that were considered so dangerous that powerful institutions spent centuries trying to erase them from history. The forbidden knowledge that was buried in the desert is now available on your smartphone. The secret teachings that could only be transmitted through initiation are now freely accessible to anyone curious enough to look. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?